You've all been wanting me to produce an episode about EVs, and in truth, it has taken much longer than I expected. If you're expecting me to spend the next 26 minutes slagging off electric cars, then you may be disappointed. But don't worry, there's plenty of ranting to do, and there's an awful lot to say. I should stress, of course, that I'm not a scientist. I do not have a team of researchers, and that everything I'm going to talk about is based on my own findings from credible sources. When I started researching my EV episode, it was going to focus on all the ways that electric vehicles are worse than petrol cars. Range anxiety, the cost of electric cars versus petrol, environmental impact, the lack of infrastructure, etc., etc. And I guess that's what you all want me to rant about as well. Mainly because it's an easy target, and also because you know you won't face the backlash from the EV evangelists. I will. The environmental argument assumes that changing petrol and diesel cars to electric will help save the planet, and that's why it's so important. But it won't. Pretty quickly, I realised I was missing the big picture, and it seems most people, and indeed governments, are too, though in the latter's case, deliberately so. So here's the big statement for this episode. The whole move to electric vehicles will make no meaningful difference to global warming and the reduction of greenhouse gases if you don't address the main causes. And right now, we're not. And if we don't stop the largest nations on Earth increasing their share of greenhouse gases, the planet dies anyway. Converting all cars to EVs will give us what? A few more months of life on Earth? Not even that. Do I have your attention now? Good. Welcome to the Car Guys. I appreciate it's a more serious episode than usual, but I still hope you enjoy it. Quick definition check. When it comes to global warming and climate change, they are not the same thing. Global warming is what humankind through industrialization is doing to the planet to increase greenhouse gases and increase global temperatures. Climate change includes global warming, but it also includes all the natural reasons for global temperature variation, including cyclical ocean patterns like El Niño and La Nina, volcanic activity, changes to Earth orbit, and the sun's energy output. Remember, the Earth has been cooling and heating for millions of years before humans. Now, before I get inside the Car Guys studio, and for those of you who don't seem to be able to get through 5 or 6 minutes of our episodes without making a comment, here's a quick primer on what I'm going to cover this week. And I'll also add chapter markers so you can skip to the various parts of this episode. 1, why EVs are not the answer to global warming. Number 2, major causes of greenhouse gases and the countries producing them. Number 3, why do cars seem to get all the attention? Number 4, where does your electricity actually come from? And number 5, what are the answers or solutions? So lots to talk about. I'm going to get inside in the warm, and I hope you stick around. First of all, when it comes to electric vehicles, or EVs as they're known, I should make it clear that I have no stake in this. I'm not an EV evangelist, I don't hold any stock, and I don't care about them one way or the other. I'm pretty sure you can all see that I'm a petrol head, which is of course a non-threatening historic term, not a statement of activism. I'm happy to admit that I love petrol-powered vehicles. I like the way they sound, smell, and accelerate. They have soul, character, they empower us, liberate us, and they have for over 120 years. They are fantastic. And if you're a regular viewer of this channel, you will also know that I'm not that bothered about joining clubs or being part of trendy causes or saying the right things just because it's the zeitgeist. I could talk about how certain companies are preying on your own eco-consciences to pay top dollar for poor build quality, zero accountability, and potentially wildly dangerous software. But by the same token, I could also mention incredible performance, super cool technology, and the possibility of being picked up by your own car when you're drunk. That sounds pretty good to me. In truth, I don't really have a problem with EVs. If you want one, that's fine by me. And let's face it, they have lots of amazing tech in them that makes life and driving easier. I understand that many of you are buying EVs for purely economic reasons. They make sense for your lifestyle. And because of a combination of subsidies, lack of congestion charges, and cheaper home electricity, they are more cost effective to run than a regular car. At the moment. If I had that kind of lifestyle, who knows, even I might have one. I also agree that if internal combustion engine cars are replaced with EVs in dense cities, that this will have a positive effect on air quality, particularly in developing nations. No question, that makes sense, in the same way that banning smoking on flights is a no-brainer. So I'm not anti-EV. Yes, I own lots of petrol cars and I want to continue to use them, but I am pro-choice. If you want to get one, go for it. But if you don't, you shouldn't be forced into them either. What I have a major problem with is how EVs are being touted as the saviour of the planet. Spoiler alert, they're not. I have a problem that governments are ignoring the real causes of global warming in favour of easy vote-winning car bashing. I do have a problem with banning internal combustion engine cars rather than allowing it to be a personal choice, especially when any look at the data will show that they are not the problem and will make negligible difference to global warming. And I also take great issue with that special kind of EV evangelist who thinks that they are saintly, righteous planet savers and petrol car owners should be vilified, abused and censored. In all but a few countries, if you have an EV, you are still using fossil fuels and spoiling the planet. So take that smug look off your face. That is the big EV lie, and this week we're going to explore it in detail. We're all being pushed towards electric cars, and we're being told that this is to reduce CO2 emissions and save baby koalas. I'll go into how electricity is generated a little bit later, but for now it's important to clarify that unless you live in a tiny number of countries, like for example Norway, Iceland and Brazil, the electricity for your car comes largely from fossil fuels. And that is unlikely to change, especially if we're all forced into EVs in the next 10 years. There is simply not enough clean electricity to cope with demand, and many countries do not and will not have the natural infrastructure to allow it to happen. All the countries that generate over 90% of clean energy are defined by a small number of distinct factors. They have a small population, or are small geographically, have abundant natural resources, e.g. geothermal, or have a mix of the above plus nuclear. So that's large, fast-flowing rivers, the ability to dam them, lots of sunlight, wind, etc. So for all other countries in the world, the source of that electricity that you think is the answer to reducing our consumption of fossil fuels comes from fossil fuels. And EV take-up right now worldwide is 9% of vehicle registrations. Imagine how much energy we'd need if governments get their way and force us all into them. And where do you think that's all going to come from, given that we can hardly cope now? In terms of EVs themselves, as many smart people already know, during manufacture they generate a huge amount of environmental damage, mining for cobalt, nickel and lithium, and all the other materials required. And there's not enough natural resources of those materials to make all the EVs of the future. And let's not forget the human rights abuses employed to mine all the material in areas of the world that you don't like to talk about at parties, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, where batteries account for 60% of cobalt mined. Hard to feel virtuous about your new electric car when it was made with slave labour and questionable safety practices. And if you keep replacing them every few years, say on a lease agreement, which is the most popular way of funding an EV right now, you are making the problem worse, not better. But at least those new batteries are fully recyclable, right? Oh. If you really cared about the planet, you would buy an older, efficient, reliable petrol car that's more than 5 years old and run it until it physically dies. Voila, the smallest carbon footprint for a car. Just a shame that misguided political initiatives like car scrappage schemes have robbed us all of those cars, eh? But let's assume you can build ethical volume electric cars by 2030 that will offer high range, quick charging, are lightweight, and don't cover people in acid when they crash. The simple fact is that will still make a negligible difference to combating global warming. Why? Because cars are a tiny part of the global problem, yet they seem to get all the press attention and legislation. There are far greater issues that, if addressed, would make a difference, and far greater countries than the UK or even Europe that are the main culprits. And if we don't fix those, we're all doomed regardless. Prior to the pandemic, the world produced 51 gigatons of greenhouse gases a year. In 2020, that decreased to 31 gigatons, reflecting the reduction in commerce, industry, and worldwide travel. A gigaton is 1 billion metric tons, or 2.2 trillion pounds. That's 9 zeros. So that's 31 billion tons of greenhouse gases in a quiet year, 51 billion in, for example, 2019, a typical early 21st century year on Earth. And you'll note, I'm not just talking about the UK, where I'm from. This is a global problem, and the UK is, well, it's a bit small. In fact, the UK's total emissions in a year is 0.46 of a gigaton. So what are the headline sources of global greenhouse gas emissions? Well, number one is agriculture and forestry, 33.2%, the power industry, 27.4%, transport, 16.2%, other industrial, 15.7%, and buildings, 7.6%. So surprise, surprise, despite all the political focus, resources and legislation levied at cars, the biggest generators of global emissions is in fact industry, accounting for 43.1%, followed by agriculture and forestry at 33.2%. Transport, including all forms of road, sea and air, is 16.2% of the global problem. Given the scaremongering in the press, I bet you thought it would be more than that, didn't you? Included in that 16.2% or 8.2 gigatons for the global transport category is HGVs, vans, buses, trains, domestic and international shipping, aviation, and not forgetting cars. And if we chop out road cars specifically from the transport category, they account for 45% or 3.6 gigatons. And yet we've had draconian laws to ban internal combustion cars, added congestion zones to our cities, and lots of new transport taxes for cars as well. So what's being done about the other 47.4 gigatons, or 93% of the world problem? In the UK, the transport category accounts for 24% of greenhouse gases, but that's only because we have very little industry and agriculture compared to other countries. And we also have a drastically reduced number of power stations and increased reliance on gas, which is piped in, and so the greenhouse gases are produced elsewhere in the world. All this means is that the energy supply figure is far smaller and pushes up the transport percentage compared to the global figures. That's why it's important to look beyond one country and at the global picture. That's the split of the global greenhouse gases by category dealt with. Now let's look at it by country and see which ones are most responsible. And when it comes to global greenhouse gas emissions, there's only one place to start: China. China currently has 1,058 coal-powered power stations and is building over 350 more. According to the latest EDGAR greenhouse gases total emissions by country study, of the 51 gigatons of greenhouse gases generated in 2018, pre-pandemic, 13.7 gigatons was China alone, which in 2020 was 32.5% of all of the Earth's greenhouse gases. The USA was 12.6%, India 6.7%, and Russia was 4.7%. So the top four greenhouse gas producing single countries equate to 56% of the global problem. 56! Europe, incidentally, contributes 7.3%. So that's 27 countries contributing just over the amount of India. So now you can see quite clearly that if we don't do something about those countries, there is no point focusing on small gains in small countries. Who cares if Europe hits its Paris Agreement targets when China has just grown its emissions by 250% since 1990? But even that's not the entire story, because there are in fact two big mitigating factors for China. Number one, it has a large population, 1.4 billion, and number two, it already has and is growing its green energy, far beyond many other countries. So point one means that you would expect China's emissions to be high because it has so many people. America's emissions are half that of China's, but it has less than a quarter of the population. If you look at the emissions per capita, i.e. the size of population, China is 51st with 9.7 tonnes per person. Qatar is number one with a staggering 66.2 tonnes per person. Australia is at number 10, Canada at 15, USA at 19, and the UK at 68. Bear in mind that China also produces 30% of the world's goods, including a vast amount of the pointless Western plastic items, which means it shoulders the greenhouse gas burden of manufacture, whilst the countries buying the goods get away scot-free. And in terms of point 2, although China has more coal-powered power stations than anyone else, and is busy burning through the world's coal reserves, at the same time it is investing heavily in renewables so that it can be self-sufficient far more quickly than many other nations. China is the largest manufacturer of solar panels and technology. It's commissioned 48 new nuclear power stations since the year 2000, and it has 51 in total. It has 2 massive hydropower projects at Three Gorges and Ziludu. It now imports far more gas than coal. Gas has a lower carbon footprint, and this has taken China's annual total renewable energy to over 30% in the last 20 years. So there is every chance that China, a country that is easy to demonize because of its energy consumption and emissions, may actually become greener than all the other larger Western nations far more quickly because the infrastructure is there and it's growing fast. Whereas in the West, not so much. This is a hot topic, and it really goes to the core of the EV argument and exposes the hypocrisy spouted by many seeking to demonise petrol. There's no point moving to EV if the electricity that you use is dirtier than petrol and will actually become more expensive. Many EV owners believe they are participating in a utopian rose-tinted Garden of Eden style vision of the future, where they are helping save the planet and that their energy is free and plentiful. And that makes them better than you. I loathe these people. And it's important to see how deluded they are because of 2 very obvious factors. Number 1, where our electricity comes from, and number 2, the current lack of tax on electricity and the certainty that it will increase significantly as petrol revenues decline. As mentioned before, and as seen here in this map of the world, only a relatively small number of countries can claim to have anything even approaching low carbon energy. It's basically Brazil, Canada, Scandinavia, France, Greenland, New Zealand, the middle of Africa, and Iceland. Depending on the country you are living in, typically between 30 and 80% of your electricity is coming from gas and coal. So if you're charging your EV, you're actually burning fossil fuels to do so. EV charging points also do not prioritise green electricity to power them. It comes from the same mix as the plugs in your house. We're all in agreement that coal and gas-powered power stations need to go if we're to reduce global carbon emissions and improve air pollution. But currently in the UK, for example, they still provide 50% of the electricity. Gas in particular is a major source of energy anxiety because its cost is controlled by another country who can increase it at will. The reason this is a problem for countries like the UK and a lot of Europe is because nuclear power is in decline. And in terms of global warming, that is seriously stupid. Because nuclear is one of the safest ways to generate energy, and it generates the least greenhouse gas emissions, even less than wind and solar. If you were serious about saving the planet, you would all be protesting to build as many nuclear power stations as possible. Like China's doing, in fact. Unfortunately, the short-sighted, ignorant anti-nuclear protesters have been successful in reversing many nuclear power programs, most notably in France, Germany, but also the UK. And how about this for a f***ed up fact? If we shut down all the nuclear power plants on Earth, we would actually emit an additional 2.5 gigatons of greenhouse gases. Why? Because you would need additional fossil fuel power sources to balance out the remaining solar and wind. What about those green saviours then, solar and wind? Certainly the UK is betting big on those, mainly because our politicians have little understanding of what they're doing. The biggest thing to consider with wind and solar is that they're both dependent on the weather, so by definition, they are not dependable at all. If it stops being windy or sunny, but yet you still need to turn the lights on in your house, what do? In theory, wind, solar and hydropower are the ideal solutions for clean energy, particularly hydropower. But as I've discussed earlier in this episode, unless you are a small country or one with specific natural features or climate, they cannot provide a nation's entire energy requirements. Look at the UK, it's almost always raining and cloudy and not always windy. There are also other downsides of proliferating a nation with those oh so virtuous wind and solar farms. Such as, you need a vast amount of land to be cleared, killing everything there before. They kill vast numbers of birds, bats and other animals. You need enormous resources like cement and concrete to build them. Solar panels are not recyclable or long-lasting. Wind generator blades are not recyclable or long-lasting. You cannot generate enough reliable energy with them to supply our needs, especially if electricity demand soars. Like if, for example, we all buy electric vehicles. So in summary then, when it comes to where our electricity comes from to power all those EVs, there are no clean hands. Many of these so-called green energy sources are not as green as you think. Nuclear is actually not as bad as we've been told all these years, and we definitely need to reduce our reliance on gas, as we have done with coal. Make no mistake, we are in an energy crisis with rising costs and the real prospect of shortages. The move to EVs at this precise time seems like a luxury we cannot afford, especially since cars, as we've shown, are not really the problem to be focused on. Simple really, they're an easy target. We see cars every day, so the majority of people can imagine the cumulative real-world effect if we're told they're all evil. We are used to replacing them, so it's not a big step to think of replacing them with an EV. We are used to them costing a lot of money, so all those taxes are essentially already accounted for, which means governments get away with increasing them incrementally and adding new ones. The main causes of global warming are not in our backyard, so we ignore them. The main causes are largely unfathomable and so huge that our brains cannot comprehend how to deal with them. And car drivers are not militant and so largely accept being bullied around without taking obstructive action, unlike, say, climate change activists. Remember when diesel was meant to be a good idea? We were all legislated and pushed into diesel vehicles in the 90s and 2000s with the promise of better fuel economy, which meant we were using less fossil fuels. What a complete lie that turned out to be. We now know that diesels are far more harmful to the environment, air quality and us than petrol cars. And now we're all being told to get rid of them, that they're evil. Who would want a diesel? Yuck! The biggest car U-turn and lie in recent history. I can't help but wonder if this is the dark future of EVs, when we all suddenly realise the true cost of making them, running them on fossil fuel-based electricity, and then of course trying to dispose of them. Like wind generator blades, are EVs all destined to be quietly buried in landfills? Will the downsides of EVs be constantly downplayed until there's a replacement, and then suddenly it'll be revealed that we were all fooled for years? So we're almost at the end of this episode. What have we learned and what can we do to help fix the problem? Well, the answer for all of us is to force our elected officials and governments to focus on the real issues of global warming and to not try and mollify us with climate window dressing. The causes of global warming are enormous, global, and will require a fundamental change to our society and the way we've been living. Did you realise, for example, that this month Royal Caribbean International launched the largest cruise liner in history, the Wonder of the Seas, the greatest single polluting device on the planet? This kind of climate hypocrisy has got to stop. But it has very little, if anything, to do with cars, which have been a humankind changing force for good and advancement. Cars and personal mobility is a fundamentally positive force in the world, and it's time we all realised it and got behind them. So in conclusion, here are some possible solutions that we should embrace and look at with an open mind and a global long-term view. Number one, stop demonising car and van drivers. Most people cannot afford EVs or don't have the ability to charge them at home, so stop saying they are evil and work the problem. Instead of blockading motorways and, ironically, causing greater greenhouse gases, focus on governments and not hard-working people. Number two, EVs need green electricity or it's pointless. If you want enough electricity for people to charge EVs, then we need to massively increase clean energy production for countries without natural advantages. It's the only way to generate enough green electricity before we crack fusion. Number 3, focus on nuclear expansion. Reverse the current trend for mothballing nuclear power plants and, like China, begin mass production of new nuclear power plants. Also increase significantly R&D for the universe's most abundant free green energy source, hydrogen, instead of betting everything on batteries. Number 4, accept that zero emissions is impossible for mankind to continue and evolve. Some global warming is necessary for mankind's development and is acceptable, but if we reduce the majority of it, the planet will recover. Number 5, stop protesting and actually get to work making a difference. Where is the worldwide concern to help countries like India swap coal-powered power stations into nuclear? Why aren't we helping countries of the world who are currently chopping down forests, like in Brazil and Ivory Coast? After all, that will make the biggest difference to global warming. Number 6, focus legislation on things that really make a big difference to global warming. Freight transport, cruise liners, industry, buildings, deep sea dredging, deforestation, removing coal-powered power stations in favour of nuclear, and lastly, bring an end to pointless consumerism and fast fashion. So there you have it, folks. Not quite the EV episode that you were expecting, but hopefully you've enjoyed it and hopefully you found it thought-provoking. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't worry, after this serious direction, next week and beyond, it's back to Supercar City. Thank you for watching. If you like what we're doing on The Car Guys, please subscribe, leave comments and likes. There'll be another episode next week.